Long time no see.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello, good evening. It's late and very quiet here, so I hope I can stay awake long enough. Normally, you know, I'm traveling to the Netherlands every month for a week to do my teaching work, but since March that all happened online, and of course there are no concerts to travel to either. So, yeah, everybody has mostly negative consequences of the present situation, but the biggest one, as far as I'm concerned, is that for me, you know, making music is a collaborative phenomenon. So one of the things that I look forward to most about my time with the teaching job is that I'm performing there with my electroacoustic ensemble, which consists of mostly students, and so there's always a sense of making music together with people. Yeah, the situation there is very restricted at the moment, as you all know very well. I'm not the kind of composer who is happy to sit around at their desk for months on end and not be away from it, because actually one of the things that I find most inspiring and energy producing, if you like, is the act of working with people and making music together with people.
We had a wonderful moment when we first got to hear I Blink, where we all sort of we all text each other at the same time, like it's like we're playing together again. It was virtually that same experience of all being in the same space and collaborating and making noise together that we hadn't had in months. And it's about as close, I think, as any of us have come to really collaborative music making.
That was one of the strongest motivations towards doing it, you know, because when you came up with the idea of working with you on this series, initially, the first thought in my mind is, how can we make an ensemble piece out of this situation? And I don't know about you people, but I've seen a number of attempts to for people to play together on Zoom and other conference programs and things like that. And it's good that people are making that effort, but on the other hand, all you're ever going to get in a situation like that is this kind of simulation of something else, you know, a kind of not quite all there kind of version of what you would normally do. So in various ways, you know, the opportunity to work on this thing with you was that actually it's not a simulation of something else. It's a thing in itself. And importantly, you know, it's not a kind of idea that I would have thought of under any other circumstances. And it brought in its wake, I think, some new ways of thinking about music and sound and instruments and voices and so on. So actually one of the principal motivations that I have as a creative musician is that the work I do should embody some kind of response to the circumstances in which it happens, you know, the social circumstances, the historical, political circumstances and so on, but not so much in an anecdotal sort of way, like being about some event in the world, but on the other hand, to use those circumstances as opportunities for some kind of creative renewal and for opening new possibilities and making myself think in ways I hadn't thought of before, which hopefully then leads to a kind of music which is a renewal of musical possibilities.
And with that idea of musical possibilities, one of the things I think I was most struck by, particularly my second or third listen to I Blink, was recognizing that you had given us parameters for improvisation, but you hadn't necessarily built a form of the piece when you'd sent those. So certain moments of the form were inevitably going to be determined by how and what we improvised. You gave a broad structure, and then you had to recreate formal parameters around what you didn't know was going to happen.
Well, yeah, but being open to those possibilities was one of the most exciting things about it, as far as I was concerned. When I was thinking about these ideas and what I should write down and what I should not write down and how to organize the materials that I would send to you, obviously I was making certain predictions about how it would go. And, you know, you have these sustained harmonies which gradually open out from the unison to the big chord that happens just before the end. So that and the durational structure of all of these little sections was built into it from the start. But what I found quite interesting is that in order to create the right degree of openness in framing this material that I would send, it's almost like I had to think of very many different possible pieces, together with the thought that actually the piece I'm going to end up with, or the piece we're going to end up with, is not going to be any of those things. But it's going to be somewhere within the range which they kind of map out. So there's a lot of food for thought in this process, I think, and it has a lot of implications for composition and collaboration, which I think will play themselves out in the fullness of time. But indeed, yes, the question of what would be delivered by the improvisational materials. Well, you know, I'm a believer in the idea that if you trust people to improvise, then you accept what they do, and you don't say, well, yeah, that's very good, but it's not quite what I was looking for, because that's kind of putting it the other way around from the way I would want to approach it, which is to say that I don't really know what I'm looking for until I see what's there. And there's a metaphor that I very often use in this kind of context, because I was brought up near the seaside, and something that I still like to do when walking along a beach is picking up stones and deciding whether I'm going to keep them or not, and then ending up, once I get to the other end, with some little collection rather. When I'm doing that, I don't think to myself, there is some particular characteristic which I'm looking for here. But as this little collection gradually builds itself up, it begins to take on certain characteristics of its own, which are the product of the, on the one hand, what is there, and on the other hand, the way my mind is working at that particular time. So that by the time I get to the end of it, these things I have in my hand have something in common with one another. So when listening through to the more improvisational aspects of what you people produced, at first, you know, I didn't want to make any decisions along the lines of I like this, I don't like this, I'm going to keep this, I'm not going to keep this. But instead, I was much more kind of systematic than that, in saying that whatever happens, the first 1/3 of the violin recording is going to take place in this section, or at least enough of it to make that meaningful, so that I was making those decisions were placed a little bit outside me. That I didn't want to depend too much on my first impressions of whether something would fit or not, because I want to find out whether something fits by putting it there. And if it doesn't fit, then the not fitting can be just as interesting as fitting. You know? It's like a lot of composers talk about putting together their material so that it works. And I always think, well, what do we mean by work, actually? When something works, what do we actually mean by that? And maybe what's more interesting is to go a kind of stage beyond that and to say, well, what we can explore what it means for something to work by questioning that idea within the way that we produce the music. And that's not just a kind of philosophical conceit, but it's, once more, it's a way of opening up possibilities of thinking of things, hearing things in a different way, and thinking oneself in unaccustomed ways that expand the consciousness of the creative musician, and thus we hope expand the consciousness of the people who hear the music.
When we recorded, particularly the improvisational sections, none of us had any idea what the other people had done. That there was no conversation, there was no decisions made collectively about how we were going to approach it. It was just all of us in the room alone. And I'll be curious to hear, again, how listeners react to what fits, what doesn't, what's cohesive, based on this material.
Well, one thing that was really interesting and unexpected for me was that part of the material that I gave to the instrumentalists was a series of pitches which would extend throughout the range of that instrument. And as this loop of 36 pitches is repeated, each time the player is asked to leave out a certain proportion of those pitches and replace them with sounds of their own choosing. So there is always a certain amount of continuity in what they do, and there's always a certain amount of spontaneity as well. And I've used in a number of other pieces, particularly in the Codex series up until now. And normally, I'm either on hand to say, what I mean by this idea is this, or on the other hand, in some cases, the players are all in the same room and they work it out between themselves. But in this case, we didn't have that at all. So that these, the realizations of this particular kind of material ended up being far more different from one another than is usually the case. That was really quite a surprise, you know, because I think one of the difficulties in putting down a score for improvising musicians, it's very difficult to find exactly the right degree of precision in the way that one expresses oneself, because one needs to express oneself extremely precisely in describing things which are in no way precise. Yeah, one obviously doesn't always succeed in doing that, because unlike with most notated music, there isn't necessarily a tradition behind it which gives people an idea of how to approach a particular kind of notational object when they see it. So in this case, it could go in many different directions, and I found that really interesting in the end. And, you know, another thing, of course, that was unexpected was the rather unusual tuning of the piano. And when I first heard the piano material, I thought, okay, now what are we going to do with this? And I thought, I can't do anything about it in terms of retuning individual notes. And one of the solutions, of course, as you will all have heard, is to make the piano more out of tune than it was to begin with. So that you have these moments when, I mean, one of the really interesting things about dealing with this material is that there are very few moments when there's only one violin, one cello, one bass, one piano and one percussionist, and indeed there's a lot of places where there's more than one voice as well. And so when there was more than one piano, then the two pianos would be tuned apart from one another, so that the discrepancies within the instrument would be kind of subsumed in the discrepancies between the instruments. And I'm not sure whether I would have done that had the piano been perfectly in tune the first time. A lot of the things that happen in the piece are very dependent on discrepancies in intonation, because of course the three string players being in separate places, not being able to tune to one another and then playing the same pitch, that can give rise to all kinds of interesting situations, and that was part of the intention. And for example, violin and cello and bass all have alternations between 4 different pitches, which are in 2 different octaves. Whereas in the piece as it was composed, the cello part was transposed up 1 octave and the bass part was transposed up 2 octaves, so they all ended up in the same place. But intonationally, the situation was very different from that. This is one of the things that gives the music its inner life, as far as I'm concerned. Because, for example, if we take the beginning where you have this unison G on the voice and all the instruments, if that was perfectly in tune and I placed the sounds in this kind of virtual binaural environment in the positions that they were in, it would be very difficult to really appreciate which sound was which. So in that case, I actually introduced a very slow fluctuation in pitch up to an eighth of a tone either side of the original pitch, which again subsumes any discrepancies in intonation that are already there within a more generalized kind of slightly frayed unison. Well, anybody who knows my work at all well will know that this idea of things that are not quite in unison is something that happens there very often. One of the reasons for that is the way that my musical sources are to a great extent outside the tradition of Western classical music. In this case, I was using technological means to bring about that, a particular kind of unison where the different lines are doing more or less the same thing, but slightly differently, which enables us to hear how they differ from one another. In classical music, there's very often an emphasis on making sounds blend together, and that's really the last thing I want to happen. You know, I'm much more interested in a particular change in kind of balance between togetherness and separateness in the sounds that occur simultaneously.
We've traversed so much of the subject of our improvisation. How much in your compilation of the piece, I guess, for Black, how much of it did you feel as an improviser or as a composer? And or how much are those two things different in your, like, are they separate, compartmentalized?
That's a question I think about quite a lot. I came to a realization maybe 18 years ago or so. Well, up until that time, maybe the compositional or the notational and the improvisational aspects of my work had been carrying on in parallel. And then it seemed that I was beginning to find ways in which they would be seen as two different aspects of the same thing. So I had to find a way of thinking about this. And my way of thinking about it is to say, composition is what is always happening. And improvisation is one of the methods to make that happen, to bring about a condition where music can be made. And there are certain musics which can only be brought about through improvisation, and others, obviously, which can only be brought about through notated composition or studio composition or different forms of collaboration or whatever. And expanding on this idea of not notation or improvisation, but getting beyond that sense of duality, which I've never really felt is particularly relevant to the way that I think, to the way that musicians think in general. That leads to ideas like the piece that we've done together. And coming back specifically to the section that you're talking about, that came about as a process of trial and error, really, because I had all of the instrumentalists alternating at different speeds between the same A and the same C sharp. And layering those on top of one another, it seemed to be very difficult to find a way of making the whole sound more than the sum of its parts. And so what I did instead, after worrying for a while as to how this should be done, was I took each instrumental part separately and laid them end to end in the computer. And made each one of them the same length. I think I took 2 minutes of each one because they all had different lengths, and I wanted to make sure that in the final result, each instrument was there for an equal amount of time. And then I operated a granulation procedure on this whole thing so that what you hear is skipping several times a second between all of these points in the sound file and between instruments. So a note that begins on the violin then ends on the vibraphone, and so that goes on. I think what happens in that section of the piece, there are 2 layers of that going on simultaneously. And so once the solution had been found, it was just a question of running the program and tweaking the parameters until they produced the right kind of sound. But there are not very many sounds in the piece which were not produced by one of you at some point. There are only two that weren't actually that I can think of. And one of them is this strange chorus that happens in the background of the solo vocal part in the middle. Now, strangely enough, that that sound does not originate from voices at all, but it's a completely synthetic sound. And before I started working on this piece, I was experimenting with making synthetic sounds that sounded like voices. And so eventually there is what happens at the beginning of the last section when this huge harmony opens out with this electronic orchestra. That was actually the first part of the piece to be realized in sound, of course, because I was waiting for the recordings to arrive, and I thought, well, I might as well do this part now, because this is going to be realized electronically. So there are, I don't know, 16 virtual electronic instruments going on there, which gradually narrow down to the highest and lowest at the end. And actually, when I was working on those sounds, I was working to my time scheme, which suggested that this final part should be 1 minute long. And in the end, it's just over 3 minutes long, because somehow it needed to extend itself in that way in order to express what it needed to. Now, you're maybe going to ask me, well, what is it expressing? And that's a very difficult thing to say, because one of the things that is very clear in various aspects of this piece is a kind of expanded concept of counterpoint. For example, the music and the text are in counterpoint with one another. The improvised and notated passages are in counterpoint with one another to a certain extent. And also, at the moment when this farewell takes place at the end of the piece, and this enormous sonic landscape opens up, is the moment when all the instruments have stopped playing and you don't hear any instruments after that. So that's a kind of somehow contradiction in terms, because I think it would be a rather cheesy climactic moment if that had been done with instruments. But instead, yeah, this sonic landscape is something which is entirely contained within the head of the listener as well, because if you listen to it binaurally, all of the different spatial positions of the piece are basically, yeah, contained within your head and within a few inches of it.
The spatialization is so strikingly a part of the experience, in a way that I didn't predict would be. You managed to neutralize those the six different spaces in which we recorded into their own virtual space in the work. It maintains and even expands the communicative potential, not detracts from it by being virtual.
Yeah, well,
the idea of virtual.
Yeah, I'm glad it came out like that, but I think, since the lockdown period in the spring, I first of all started experimenting with making binaural versions of multi-channel electronic pieces, just basically to ask the question, is it possible to have a more accurate experience of this music under headphone listening conditions, which a lot of people are in most of the time these days. And I found, well, yes, it is. You do hear more openness and transparency than in a conventional stereo mix, but also there are things about the binaural processing which are not particularly realistic, and things which maybe don't work as well as they could do, or as well as they eventually will when the technology is perfected and so forth. But then, of course, at a certain moment, one starts to think, well, how can we use those things as compositional materials instead of making a simulation of an 8-channel piece being played in a space? Why not use the characteristics, just like as with an instrument, the characteristics of the binaural processing environment for themselves? This was something which I kind of taught myself to do in the course of composing, because it was a bit haphazard at first, and there were a few versions of different segments of the piece, which I discarded because they were just like practice runs, if you like. But then eventually I settled down to a kind of system whereby I would first mix the sounds together that I thought would be appropriate for a particular segment of the piece. I was listening on headphones all the time because, you know, whether it was binaural or not, just because it seemed to me this was the environment I was working in. And then I made a template in the software where there would actually be 24 channels, so 8 here, 8 above, and 8 below. And then I would assign the sounds in my mix to different points in that kind of spherical environment. And this was arrived at by fairly empirical means. Once I started using it, it opened up all kinds of directions. Like, for example, I worked on all the slow sections first. And as you know, all the slow sections have 2 voices, and the 2 voices are always in the same place, except in one of them where there are 8 voices and they're all kind of spread around. And then when it came to the more rapid moving sections with the improvisation in, then the first one has the voice placed in the center where you would be standing on stage. But then, of course, other possibilities presented themselves. So each poem that I used consists of 8 lines. And so we could have each line in a different channel of the 8 channels surrounding the virtual head. So that's one thing that happens. And then the next time, well, you can also have them spread top to bottom as well. And so one thing that happens with the solo voice is that it gradually gets split up into kind of atomized versions of itself as it goes on. So that learning my way through the technology and each time taking it to a different level leads to a kind of one aspect of the dramatic process that's going through the piece. So coming back to your point about improvisation, that is one of the ways in which improvisation plays a part, because one of the important things about improvisation, and in fact one of the ways in which it plays a very central role in the things that I do, even with musical notation, is that it consists of putting yourself in a situation where you have to respond spontaneously to something that happens. In this case, it was a matter of trying to make myself as alert as possible to the further possibilities of all the things that I was exploring, so that as I moved on to the next part, I would be able to use those as well. And at the end of the day, and this quite often happens, I suppose it's a kind of byproduct of this way of thinking about composition, is that I get to the end of making a piece and thinking to myself, okay, but I could do another one, I could just continue it. It could go on forever, you know. And luckily it doesn't, because I think ultimately, you know, once you try to repeat yourself, once you try to keep something going beyond its natural lifespan, then the results tend not to be so interesting. But it's going to be quite an interesting challenge as we go on to make a version of this piece which can be played in real spaces, because having 8 speakers on the floor and 8 on stands and 8 on the ceiling is not something we're going to come across too often. Some realization of this will have to be made, and it's like precisely the opposite of the process that that I experienced when making the binaural versions of the original 8-channel pieces, that now in taking this music out of this space and putting it in a real space, something is going to be lost. So I have to think of maybe compensating for that in some way. I'm not quite sure yet how that's going to work. But yeah, that's just another example of how working on a project like this throws up all kinds of implications, which is very, in many ways, they take time to work out. It's all part of an ongoing learning process.
So I'm curious, your conceptualizations of sound musically and in terms of the language in Harry's poetry, how that played a role in your final product.
This is one of the aspects of the project which really I feel I've only just scratched the surface of so far. So you may get a lot more in the future. But first of all, it became clear that because this book, I Blink by Harry Gilonis, is divided into 8 sections, each of which consists of 8 poems, and each poem has 8 lines. And this 8ness needs to be an important aspect of the musical composition. And so, you know, it happens on the level of these formative harmonies, which give rise to the whole shape of the piece. So you have 1 pitch, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then up to 8. Also, the fact that 8 poems are used in the piece, of course, doesn't mean that you have 8 songs in the Maxwell Davis sense. But instead, it was kind of clear from the start that 2 of these texts were on facing pages and had the same title. So it was Taking Leaves 1 and Taking Leaves 2. And I imagined to myself that these may well have been based on the same original poem. And then I thought, so obviously, these poems need to sound simultaneously with one another. That gave rise to the way that these vocal duets worked. And it's quite interesting the way that this simultaneity works out, because sometimes you can hear 2 separate phonemes being sounded, and at other times you can't. And I'm sure that's quite deliberate on Harry's part as well, because at the beginning of the first one, you have blue, green in one side, you have moving on the other side, and you have the same vowels, but it's only the consonants which are different. And so that then became a structural determinant as well. And then, so if the piece was going to consist of 8 sections and I had 8 poems, but 2 of them were stuck together, then that means there would be 2 sections left over, which would not feature any text. So one of those is the crescendo at the beginning, and the other one is the 8-second silence that happens later on. There are very few things in the music which are not related to the original text in some way. And then when it came to the fully notated settings, of which there are 3, that was based very much on a metrical analysis of the text, so that certain syllables are given more weight in terms of duration than others. And sometimes that reflects the way that you would speak those words, and sometimes it goes in the opposite direction. That's all organized quite systematically. And then, of course, that is juxtaposed with the other 3 vocal solos where there's no musical material at all, but just some suggestions as to how they might be improvised. I like very much what you did with those, I have to say. And one of the things I like most about it is that it doesn't sound like anything I would have written. One of the possibilities might have been to do something that sounds like Richard Barrett wrote it, but that, of course, is not the point here, because if I'd wanted to write it, I could have done, you know. But instead, something different comes into being, which is based on your personality and your musical preferences, probably, and experiences, and so forth. And then I had a certain amount of leeway, of course, because there were 2 takes of each piece. And after experimenting with placing them simultaneously and stretching syllables so that they fitted together, that didn't sound too good. So in the end, each one is almost from one phrase to the next, swapping between the 2 takes. And one reason for doing that became clear to me while I was working on it. It seemed necessary, or it seemed appropriate at least, to give each one of these 3 improvised songs a particular character of its own by concentrating on some aspect of the material rather than another. So one of them might concentrate on the quieter, more whispery phrases, and another one might concentrate on the kind of big swooping Sprechgesang kind of movements, and so that then also influences the way that the instruments were brought in to produce an environment or a counterpoint or whatever you like to call it. And so, yeah, one of the particularly important examples of that is in the third of the improvised songs, where you have, I think, 4 muted pianos playing simultaneously in different places. And Jack was doing this repeated notes with muted strings and then occasionally putting in other pitches. And immediately that suggested to me, do we have enough material here to multiply that on itself several times so that it becomes a whole texture in itself? And there are also 5 violins and 3 cellos in that section as well, but it produces a very kind of dense sound texture in the end. These are things which occurred as a result of the material. Why are there 5 violins? Because there was 5 times as much material as the duration of that song was supposed to be. And so I had to find a space for all of those violins and so forth. So that means that the improvisational material very often has quite a strong structural influence on the music in ways which I couldn't have predicted, and no doubt you couldn't have predicted either. A lot of the process was about thinking about how can this be a collaboration? How do we make this into a collaborative work where every input into it makes a difference somehow at some point in some way? Even though, of course, you know, I was the person making the decisions as to what should go where, and it also involved a feeling of accepting this material as it was and not making too many value judgments about it. I had to conceive the piece in such a way that the materials that were contributed were the right materials. That there wasn't a sense of something being more or less appropriate, but everything is appropriate. And if it seems inappropriate, that's because there's something that needs to change about the overall compositional concept somewhere. In some ways, it was a kind of distanced collaboration in that I wasn't in the same country as anybody else and not at the same time either. But on the other hand, you know, everybody's sound was inside my head the whole time. So I was being inhabited by all of these sounds. And that gave it a very kind of intimate quality at the same time. And I found it fascinating, really. And I found it gave rise to very many expressive, I hope, discoveries. And I think to myself, if I'm making discoveries in the course of making music, then that's something which should be able to transmit itself to the people who hear it. Now, you know, I start thinking, okay, where can this be taken next? What is the next stage in dealing with an idea like this and developing it?
This is just I Blink 1, which implies that there's probably another I Blink.
Well, there are 64 poems, you know. I don't think it's going to be possible to get through all of them. One of the characteristics of the present situation is that everything I was working on and planning to work on in February has been postponed, you know, so this huge gap opened up. And it then became a question of thinking, how can we fill this gap meaningfully? How can we do something meaningful with this time, which takes account of it while at the same time leading to some kind of renewal of musical ideas which wouldn't have happened in other circumstances. It's up to all of us now, really, to take that out into the world somehow. I mean, not just in the context of doing online performances and so forth, but saying what implications does this experience have for the way that we conduct ourselves as musicians once the situation improves, assuming it will, if we survive that long. Yeah, again, this comes back to the idea of a type of musical activity that is a response to its circumstances. not a reflection of them, but we look around us and we see what's going on and ask ourselves questions and try to think of what the answers might be.
And it's remarkable how when we seek for those answers now, it only opens more questions. Right? There's only an inevitable continuation of those questions in other dimensions that we can take and process and seek out in the world.
Yeah, well, I'm not suggesting that we should have the answer to anything, but you know, what we want to do, of course, is make contact with people out there in the world who are also going to question what they see and hear. And that, of course, is one of the most important things that we can do as musicians working in the areas that we are. We have to be able to contribute something to the world. And it may seem like something very small, given the seemingly rather isolated nature of the musical world that we exist in. But I think you can see that as a portal through which the musical possibilities that you see dwarf the musical possibilities around them. It's a music that says more is possible than we see around us most of the time, and it's something that can encourage the people who come across it to use their imagination, not just in listening to music, but to express the idea that the human imagination is actually something very almost infinite. We are living in places and times which have a tendency to shrink that imagination down to the smallest manageable size. You know, we all conform to the norms of what is expected of us in our respective societies. But yeah, if music can do anything, one of the things it can do is emphasize the fact that there aren't actually any limitations on how we can imagine music, how we can imagine the ways in which people can live together and so forth. In order for the music to express that, it doesn't need necessarily to be heard by millions of people. But of course, it would be nice if it were. And I see, quite frankly, no reason why it shouldn't be. But yeah, that's a situation that at present we don't really have the resources to do very much about. Sure. But it's not going to stop us from trying.
No, not
Let's
at all.
bear that in mind.
And we're looking forward to continuing.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks for this conversation, and it's good to see you all looking healthy and energetic. Hopefully, we'll meet in real life at some point in the not too distant future.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Take care, everyone.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everything But the Kitchen Sink. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you'd like to hear more, you can find all the episodes of our summer series on our YouTube channel and our website, alineaensemble.org.
Also, be sure to check out our social media profiles for more information and previews of upcoming episodes. Our handle is Alinéa Ensemble.
Please feel free to share today's episode with anybody you think might like it, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Everything But the Kitchen Sink, released every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
And as always, we hope you are all safe and well. See you next time.
But sure as fuck, produce something. Do not go silently into this period just because infrastructure and restaurants and hospitals are having to behave in a totally different way. You are artists, and you are already exhibiting by the repertoire that you're showing that you have a commitment to difficulty. So remember that that's there in this period that could otherwise be perceived as silent for the next 12 months or even the next 24 months. Make sure that something spectacular is produced in this period.